It's been a busy weekend. Dance marathon, anyone? Yeah? Over $300,000 you raised. It's amazing. Way to go, you guys. Everyone involved with that, student development, everyone. Anyone attend a Hope women's basketball game this weekend? Yeah. Some outstanding play. We love you, team. You're ours forever. One of the great things about going to a college is you get to go to things like that, dance marathon, a basketball game, and also the people you get to meet along the way, like Paul Chamness in his 1500 chapel. Paul, I want to publicly apologize because you've heard me more than my mother speaking, and I want to say thank you to you. One of the great gifts of life is the people you get to travel with. Before I introduce our guests, I want to read from Lamentations chapter 5, verses 15 and 22. If you are new tonight, we have been walking through Lamentations during this season of Lent. And here we are in chapter 5. Hear the word of the Lord. The joy of our hearts has ceased, and our dancing has been turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this, our hearts are sick. Because of these things, our eyes have grown dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond a measure. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the great gifts of life are the people that you get to pilgrim with along the way. And tonight it's my great honor to introduce one of those people I've had an opportunity to pilgrim with. Dr. Rich Ray has been at Hope College for over 36 years. He's been a professor, a dean, a provost. To this community, he has been a friend. And to me personally, he has been both a mentor in leadership and a model of Christian charity and grace. He's author of more books and journals than we can name at this moment. He has been awarded awards such as being in the Hall of Fame for his own vocation in the National Athletic Trainers Association. He has been one of those people at Hope whose ripple effect reaches everywhere in our community. And he is, for me, a friend who has taught me about perseverance and how to suffer with dignity. Would you please welcome tonight our beloved Dr. Richard Ray, Provost Emeritus at Hope College.
They say the hardest thing about this task is just not tripping on 5,000 chords. I got a little map before I came up, and they said, go this way, go that way. Trig called me a couple of months ago, and he wanted me to know if I would come and speak to you tonight. When I asked him what he would want me to talk about, he paused for a moment and then sort of man-whispered over the phone, suffering. Oh, God. Really? Awesome. I said, well, how about joy or hope? Something like that? Nope. Suffering. Well, let's negotiate. Happiness or perhaps flourishing? I really pleaded with him. Sorry, pal. It's got to be suffering. Okay. Suffering it is. It's Lent, of course, and so suffering is really right on point for all of us. We're all walking toward the cross right now, and if there's a better symbol for suffering, I really don't know what it might be. But there are different kinds of suffering. When I was a kid, my mom enforced upon my brothers and me during Lent, and especially on Good Friday, a particular form of suffering. My mind always takes a trip down memory lane on Good Friday, which is coming up soon, every year, especially between noon and 3. Wherever I am or whatever I'm doing, I take on sort of a quiet, pensive mood. It's just the light dims a little and sounds are muffled. Time slows. Does my brow furrow a bit for those 3 hours every year? Maybe a bit. Our Lady of Refuge Parish School, where I went to school for the first 8 years of my school year's life, was always closed on Good Friday. The nuns released us children back into the temporary custody of our parents for the day, despite their nervousness that even 24 hours away from their instruction might render us morally bankrupt. I suspect that Sister Mary Domitilla sent instructions home to my mom with firm guidance on proper deportment for Catholic youth on Good Friday. No doubt it was chock-a-block with rules designed to prevent amusement or diversions in any form. When I asked my mom if I could go outside and play after our Lenten no-meat lunch, she routinely reminded me that it was Good Friday and that I should be thinking about Jesus dying on the cross. If I persisted, she would eventually give in and allow me some freedom out of doors. But only if I promised to think about Jesus dying on the cross. And so it was for all of my Catholic schoolmates. My brothers and I were banished to the backyard and no further, presumably so my mom could stay inside and think about Jesus dying on the cross without us 5 hellions driving her crazy. I'm convinced I did a much better job of suffering than my brothers. They were poster children for the Order of St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes. And so we'd trudge to the backyard. If I looked to the left, I'd see Pat Griffin looking glum in his backyard a few houses away. If I looked to the right, I'd see Emmett McMahon in a similar state of reflective dourness. Lenny Mutnick was Jewish, so his mother didn't make him think about Jesus dying on the cross. But she did restrict him to his backyard, which was an act of interreligious cooperation among the neighborhood mothers. We'd see Lenny kicking a ball or flying a kite and wish we were Jewish. To our 7-year-old minds, being Jewish looked a lot better than being Catholic. Not only did you not have to pretend to be sad until you finally were sad, but Hanukkah lasted 8 days, and Christmas, while very good, came and went in the blink of an eye. At 3 o'clock, my mom would lighten up a bit, but if any of us looked like we were having any fun whatsoever before then, we'd hear a tap on the window warning us away from the near occasion of sin. Well, this is only one form of suffering. It's temporary, though its effects can last a long time in the form of misguided habits. It's largely caused by the idea that there is some pleasure that we wish that we had right now, but don't. It's an important form of suffering. We can master it, obtain our freedom from it, really, only over a long time of discipline, self-denial, and the development of right habits. Your education, properly ordered, should help you grow in virtue when the temptations that lead to this form of suffering whisper in your ear. Failure to deal effectively with this kind of suffering eventually leads to the third form of suffering, about which I'll have more to say in just a minute. But before there can be a third thing, there must be a second thing. And this is the kind of suffering that Job talks about when he says this: "Is not man's life on earth a drudgery? Are not his days those of hirelings? He is a slave who longs for the shade, a hireling who waits for his wages. So I have been assigned months of misery, and troubled nights have been allotted to me. Now, Job lost his family, his health, his worldly goods, pretty much everything else during his terrible trials. All of us will experience this kind of suffering to one degree or another. To be human means to endure loss, hardship, bereavement, death, and from time to time, the isolating pain of loneliness. It's just the way life is. Jesus himself, Jesus the human being, was sorely tempted by all the things that tempt you and me. And he knew suffering. Not just suffering on the cross either. He cried real tears when his friend Lazarus dies, even in the sure knowledge that God would raise him up again, and very soon. St. Augustine reminds us of these three things. Our pilgrimage on earth cannot be exempted from trial. We progress by means of trial. And finally, no one knows himself except through trial. Of course, how we respond to this kind of suffering matters. And what also matters is how we respond when we encounter Job's lament in others, including others who are hard to like, much less love. People from whom we may be separated. People with whom we are toxically, corrosively angry. If we get this wrong, we really do damage to ourselves and to others around us. To overcome this kind of suffering requires a mature prayer life. And a mature prayer life is one where prayer is a habit. A life where we pray without ceasing. It's this kind of prayer life that casts our gaze up towards him whose mercy endures forever. Without this habit of prayer, we are unlikely to look beyond the suffering of the moment to the gratitude that endures. And without gratitude for the blessings that come from the one in whose image and likeness we are made, well, life really is just sackcloth and ash that Job describes. If God isn't true, and we're just food for worms, then weep and mourn. But if God is true, dance and sing. There's a third kind of suffering to which I alluded earlier. This is the form of suffering I want to focus on primarily tonight. This is the kind of suffering that our old friend, maybe not your old friend, but our old friend Dante Alighieri, the Dante of your cultural heritage class. Everybody's favorite. This is the one Dante talked about in his famous poem, The Divine Comedy. The story opens with Dante describing the journey of his life. He finds himself in a dark forest where, in his words, the straightforward pathway had been lost. And this is what he suddenly realizes about his life. I cannot well repeat how there I entered. So full was I of slumber at the moment in which I had abandoned the true way. Dante is basically saying, I'm lost. I don't know where I am, and I don't know how I got here. My life is on the wrong path. It's going in the wrong direction. And he's saying one additional thing. This is a critical thing, and maybe the most important thing. I abandoned the true way. He doesn't claim that anyone else forced him from the true way. He doesn't point to his left or to his right and shout, he made me do it, or I was tricked, it's not my fault. Good old Dante. He does a very hard and rare thing. He tells the truth. Of all the kinds of suffering, the type that Dante describes is perhaps the worst. Why is it the worst? Because most of us are just too little aware that we're lost. that we're on the wrong path. We're unsure of how we came to be so. It's one thing to suffer and to know why, and for what reason, and perhaps even for what greater purpose. But the thing about being lost is that we don't always, or at least immediately, know that we're lost. For many of us, we simply aren't adequately mindful of ourselves, our true nature, our principal purpose, or our heart's deepest desire. We're just not paying attention. And too often, when we get a glimpse, an inkling that we're not where we ought to be, well, it's too frightening to look any closer. There's only one thing worse than being lost, and that thing is being lost and frightened. And so we look away towards something more pleasant and diverting. Perhaps we tell ourselves one of the following fibs. I really don't drink that much. Lots of people drink more than I do. It's not really a problem. Or, pornography doesn't really change me for the worst. They're just pictures. It's not really a problem. Or, the intimacies my girlfriend and I engage in don't hurt anyone. We're both cool with it. It's not really a problem. Or how about this one? Sure, I'm angry at my lab partner, who is both lazy and a big jerk. I'm certainly not the only one that's angry with her. She deserves my anger, after all. She's got it coming. It's not really a problem. And in glancing away from the things we tell ourselves aren't problems, we wander farther still along the wrong path and away from the light. But unlike Dante, we won't admit the truth, that we are abandoning the true way. The early desert fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries committed themselves to lives of prayer, fasting, and work as ways to focus solely on God. 3 renunciations are required, they remind us, if we're going to overcome the terrible suffering that is life without God. First, we must renounce our old way of life. If we are not listening carefully for God's call to our proper vocation, we shouldn't be surprised if, like Dante, we realize one day that we are on the wrong path. This renunciation can be as dramatic as fleeing from the world as the desert fathers did, or as subtle as changing our hearts and habits. Either way, change is required. If we desire God but aren't willing to renounce our former way of life, it just seems like a poor way to get started. If we would learn to suffer properly and for all the right things, a second renunciation is required. We must renounce the very thoughts that connect us through our habits to our previous way of life. Thoughts of bodily pleasures like food and sex and material possessions are just the start. Anger, vanity, pride. These are kinds of thoughts that loom so large inside each of us that a failure to renounce them only leads us further down Dante's dark path and away from the light. And thoughts are a big challenge. Each of us has a video running through our mind all day long. Does the video in your head yoke you to a way of life you'd hope to renounce? To your pride? To your anger? To your desire for pleasure as a substitute for true happiness? Mine certainly can. Learning to guard our thoughts, to be aware of our thoughts, to recognize our thoughts, and turn them toward God in prayer is a critical moment in our journey towards true happiness, towards flourishing, and away from the self-imposed suffering that characterizes our departure from the true way. And finally, if we would learn to put suffering in its place, we must renounce, and this one's tough, we must renounce our puny, limited, constricted, bracketed understanding of God. None of us has a large enough imagination for who God is and what God can do. And so we live with our sins and with our suffering, too afraid to give voice to them, too timid to believe, really believe that God can heal us, to make of us new creations. Our former way of life, our thoughts that connect us to that way of life, are constricted, even unfaithful way of imagining who God is. These three things we must renounce if we are to suffer less, or at least suffer for the right reasons. These renunciations take a lifetime, but we have to start sometime. St. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Corinthians that now is a very acceptable time. For millennia, people have searched for God and for an antidote to suffering by going on pilgrimage, to work it out by walking. In Latin, solvitur ambulando. The Israelites were a pilgrim people when they fled the awful power of Pharaoh, wandered in the desert for a very long time, and finally arrived in the land promised to them by God, a promise fulfilled despite their lack of faithfulness. This pilgrimage was remembered in later years, when Jews 3 times per year would once again make pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, singing the Psalms of Ascents as they went up to make sacrifice. The Magi, the 3 kings, the wise men, they were pilgrims too, in search of the newborn king about whom they had been told. Cleopas and his fellow disciple in mourning made a pilgrimage to Emmaus, and then they ran back to Jerusalem in the dark over the rough Roman road, braving the terrors of the night to announce the good news that their Savior lives. And Christians throughout the centuries have made pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Rome, and to other holy places. Pilgrims walk for many reasons: to atone for sins, to discern God's call for their lives more carefully, to renounce their former way of life and the thoughts that yoke them to that way of life, to reimagine who and what God really is. Solvitur ambulando, to work it out by walking. I was suffering a couple of years ago, and frankly, pretty badly. Like Dante, I was on the wrong path, unsure of how I arrived there, and frightened of where it might lead. I realized in that moment that if I didn't renounce my former way of life and the angry thoughts in which it was comfortably, deliciously, satisfyingly clothed, I would die a bitter old man. Anger fills us with a sense of disordered righteousness. Anger feels wonderful, like a drug. We rage, we thunder with anger. And when we do, we imagine ourselves to be armored in truth and justice. But really, it's all just foolish pride. Anger distorts our view of who we really are and who others really are, just like a funhouse mirror does. The path I was on, like the one Dante walked, had a sign that read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But anger and suffering didn't have to be the final word for me. It doesn't have to be the final word for you either. Suffering didn't have to be the ultimate condition that defined my life. For just as sure as I could see Dante's warning flashing in big neon colors, through the grace of a God who is too big for me to understand, I could also see another sign. This one from the prophet Jeremiah, who says this: "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." I was at Mass one Sunday about the time I recognized that I had lost the true way, when my longtime friend Joe approached me and said, "I'm thinking of making a pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago. Want to come? That part of my humanity that is not connected to conscious thought, but instead springs from my deepest desire, recognized in those two sentences that God was throwing me a lifeline. My response to Joe, when do we leave? The Camino de Santiago, literally the Way of St. James, is one of Christianity's oldest and most important pilgrimage journeys. Medieval pilgrims began their pilgrimage from wherever they lived. They just walked out their front door. They walked to the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain, where tradition claims that the body of St. James the Apostle rests. And then they turned around and walked home. I took an airplane home. While most modern pilgrims begin the journey in western France, I met pilgrims who began in Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, England, Ireland, Korea, Brazil, the Philippines, Australia, Japan, Israel, and many other places, really from every continent. Were we all walking to the actual burial site of St. James? I haven't the faintest clue. Martin Luther, no fan of pilgrimages, is said to have quipped, "There were 12 apostles, and 18 of them are buried in Spain." What I do know, and this really is my testimony, is that my 500-mile walk was a kind of long-form retreat that taught me how to pray without ceasing, led me to forgive my enemies, and to seek God's forgiveness for my own brokenness. Salvator ambulando. I became a new creation on the Camino. I rediscovered the true way, and thus put behind me the third form of suffering. Each of us is a pilgrim on the way towards the cross, and beyond it to Easter, and the greatest joy the universe has ever known. The greatest joy the universe has ever known. Each of us is seeking our heart's deepest desire. How will you, each of you, during what's left of this Lenten season, how will you find the true way? How will you cast off your fears, renounce your old way of life, the thoughts that yoke you to that way of life, and give yourself without reservation to a God none of us has the capacity to properly imagine? Perhaps a good place to begin is with the first word of the rule of St. Benedict, Ausculta. Listen. Listen for God's voice. And perhaps you'll hear him calling, just as I did. And when you hear him calling, Salvator ambulando. Work it out by walking.